Hi, everybody. This is Mike, and today we're going to talk about water. And more specifically, we're going to talk about groundwater and the legislation that is surrounding it. I'm not an expert in it, so we've brought somebody in. His name is Chase Hurley, and I'll just introduce Chase a little bit with his bio. So Chase attended Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and obtained a ag marketing degree in 1989. Since then, he's been very active in ag production and water resources for the last 30 years. From 2004 to 2017, he was the general manager of San Luis Canal Company in Dos Palos, California, where he represented over 300 San Joaquin River water right landowners on a wide variety of resources and policy issues. So Chase, thank you very much for coming on and trying to explain what Sigma is. So thank you.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
Can you tell us maybe a little bit about yourself and how you got into this business?
Yeah, I was born on a small family farm in Los Banos, like a lot of kids in that area. Had dairy cattle growing up, sugar beets, alfalfa, cotton, and went to college thinking that I only had one thought in my mind: to get back home and drive a tractor and be a farmer the rest of my life. And my parents sort of had a different decision for me. Halfway through college, they decided to sell the farm. So I sort of had to branch out and decide what I really want to do. So I stayed in ag production coming out of college in the garlic and onion industry. Did a little work, actually worked here in the area for Zaki Farms raising chickens. But I was given the opportunity in the early 90s to go to work for a local water district. So I did finance and policy work for a United States Bureau of Reclamation Central Valley Project water contractor outside of Fireball for 10 years. And then, well, like you said, was hired for San Luis Canal Company to be their general manager. So
And that's exchange contractors.
that's an San Joaquin River Exchange contractor, yeah. So got to work for one of the best water right districts in the state of California, and previously worked for a Central Valley Project contractor that has junior water rights to San Luis Canal Company.
Okay, now you've so you worked at San Luis Canal Company,
Right.
And then now you have your own business, and that's called WLS, stands for Water Land Solutions.
That's correct.
Okay, and what do you guys do there?
Yeah, so I left San Luis Canal Company. I'd always wanted to get back out on my own and do my own thing. Thought maybe I could do some farming and then help farmers and water folks any way I can. So it sort of matriculated into a consulting business. My vision is to get in the consulting business as a driver to help the area build water projects. I wanted to privatize myself, get in the private sector with the ultimate goal of helping finance, build, and maybe even having some ownership equity in a couple, I'll call them water storage facilities.
Okay.
Probably as we get started, underground storage basins and the ability to bank water, bank credit, sell credits, etc. But in the meantime, a lot of folks were looking for some help. We do a lot of due diligence work. If people are looking to either go out and buy land or lease land, they hire me to help them in terms of their water resources, the capability of transferring water off and on their farm, do some soil work for them, etc. So we do a lot of that. And then I sort of got drugged back into managing districts. I had a lot of history of that. So my firm, me and my partner actually manage 7 or 8 small water districts or private mutual water companies in this, in the Merced, Madera County area, but we do have a couple up north.
And so you've been mentioning a couple terms that are going to be key, kind of what we're talking about, groundwater, banking, credits, things like that.
Right.
So you guys have been getting more and more involved in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, right?
That's right.
So maybe we could start with kind of how did the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act come into play and when, and maybe why?
Right. Yeah, so California has a real diverse history in terms of water supply and how farming evolved throughout the region. So we have a huge resource right at our back door, whether it's on the east side with Eastern Sierras or Northern California. The state is water rich in Northern California on the east side and not so much in the valley and down in Southern California. So as that developed, the Bureau of Reclamation, the United States Bureau of Reclamation, wanted to get the West to grow. They knew that for the successful, future of not only California but the United States, we needed to be able to grow and produce as much of our own food as they could.
Right.
So I think they wisely invested, along with the state of California, Department of Oil Resources, in 2 massive water projects in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And that's sort of how a lot of the farming got started in the Central Valley. The east side of the valley was already in some farming modes. They've done a really good job of building assets on the eastern side, whether it's Merced Irrigation District, Turlock Irrigation District, Fresno Irrigation District.
But
etc.
that'd be dams you're talking, right?
Those are
So they're
dams
building
and reservoirs.
dams,
That's
yeah.
right. So I was just giving you a little background of how the surface water started. So those folks all have their own internal boundaries about where they deliver water, where they produce electricity for their customers. But as California continued to develop and we're putting more land in production, some groundwater production was already happening. In various parts of the valley didn't have a water contract. And then we have a lot of good soil in California, and farmers want a farm where they can produce good crops and good yields. And over time, we just kept putting land in production where a lot of it only had access to groundwater. In Northern California, there's a lot of areas up there where it's only groundwater accessible, but the groundwater table stays very high. They got a lot of snowpack in Northern California, a lot more water and rain every year than we do down here. So it's a little different there. But in the valley, we put a lot of land in production where there's only one source of water, groundwater. And I think that's where eventually it sort of caught up to us in terms of when your only source is one source, groundwater,
Right.
and it starts to go backwards a little bit. Now what do we do?
And so we have really the ability to irrigate through surface water via dams, aqueducts, canals, things like that. Then there's the groundwater.
That's right.
And how the groundwater basically got there millions of years ago through flooding, right?
That's right. So a lot of it came through flooding, and it gets your base supply of groundwater. But really what happens is on an annual basis, you get your snowpack, you get your rain, where all the hydrology begins, and it runs the underground aquifers are produced by the snowpack and the rain, and they run from east to west. There are some aquifers that run the other way, but they're all running and they maintain by the hydrology that California gets. And historically, it was a little not as many wild swings in hydrology as there have been lately, but groundwater, you have to manage it from the surface, but also rely on Mother Nature to replenish it every year.
Because there's basically just underground rivers that you don't see that are coming through, breaking off of rivers, or really just coming from the mountains.
That's right.
Percolating all the way out.
Historical aquifers have been there for years and years, and they're at different levels, different stratas of the geography, below our feet. So different levels, but the other also different quality groundwater.
Right.
So farmers are pretty good about going after the good water. They would obviously like to pump from as shallow as they can. So it's cheaper the shallower you can pump. But I think in California, the one thing we have to keep in mind is how good are we at managing both the surface water and the groundwater in a symbiotic relationship. And I think the more water, for a variety of reasons, that you pull away from agriculture, whether it's for fishery issues, other environmental issues, et cetera, then there's only one other avenue you can go to get it, and you stress the groundwater aquifer.
So in the last drought that we had, that dated back to 2000, was it 11?
Yes, last way year, yeah.
Yeah, and then it basically came through to 2015, 16.
That's right.
And in 2014, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was actually passed.
That's right.
Okay.
It was passed, and I think, at times, farmers sometimes are their own worst enemies, and I can say that because I grew up on a farm. My parents were farmers, and for a variety of reasons, we started taxing our groundwater system. Some of it which we had our own control of, and some of it which was out of our control, whether it was in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. So for a variety of reasons, we started taxing our groundwater supply, and I think we were the last state in the union without a groundwater law on the books at the state level.
Okay.
And so I think because at times we're our own worst enemy, and because at times I don't think we as a state manage our surface water supplies like we should have, we had, in my mind, this is my personal opinion, we had to get regulated from the state level. And that's what happened. Now, agriculture had a hand in trying to develop that legislation. Mm-hmm. It's not perfect. In fact, a lot of people don't like it. They wish it wasn't there. But it is there. And now the one thing in that legislation that's written in there multiple times is the state wanted to make it where you manage the program, come up with your own projects at the local level.
Right.
The state didn't want to mandate this is what you will do. Now, I think at certain areas, and maybe we'll see in the next year or two, the state may have to intervene if the locals can't get their act together and formulate a plan that the state is comfortable with.
So maybe let's go back a little bit to what the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, is really intending to do, right? They're basically trying to lower the level of which groundwater is being pumped.
Well, in some areas. So what they're trying to do is, it's very specific, is they want the groundwater levels to be sustainable through the next 20 years. They're going to start in 20-year increments.
Okay.
So what they did is they divided the state up into various subbasins, so groundwater subbasins. They developed a map. The map was developed by a variety of factors, and they produced that map along with the legislation saying, here are the groundwater basins within the state, and you as a subbasin, for all those folks that are in that subbasin, you have to develop a groundwater sustainability plan that gets you sustainable through your 20-year time frame. So for those folks that had the subbasins that were the most critical, they defined the subbasins as critical, moderate, etc.
Right.
For those the ones that were deemed critical, they had 20 years starting in 2020 to be sustain themselves to 2040. And so there's multiple subbasins right now that are in year 3 of their first 5-year protocol of becoming a sustainable.
So within a subbasin, which is basically a geologic formation where water is contained, right? It's
That's
basically a
the-
big underground pool.
That's right. That's
Okay.
the true definition of a subbasin.
Yeah.
But the subbasin we're talking about is a boundary line that the state of the Department of Water Resources drew on a map.
Got it.
And it's sort of in their mind what they can define as a subbasin, but it's really not how the subbasin acts below the surface in terms of lateral flow, etc.
Okay.
They had to start somewhere.
Okay.
So they drew their basin lines on a map with a Sharpie pen for the most part.
Okay.
And now we're having to
Got it.
manage. We the locals are having to
Yes.
manage through that.
So then the local groups that had to get together are people that are in water districts, irrigation districts, also people that are not within an irrigation district, and they formed GSAs, right?
That's
So
right.
that's a groundwater sustainability agency.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And so what is a GSA? It's a legal body.
Yeah, it's a legal body, and they're formed in different. Most of them are joint power authorities.
Okay.
And what the state said is, here's your subbasin.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone within that subbasin, you figure out how to manage it, and we want it managed through GSAs, groundwater sustainability agencies. So, at least in the agricultural community, we're all really well versed in our neighborhood, and so we got together with folks in our neighborhood within that defined groundwater sustainability basin,
Yeah.
and we formed various GSAs
Yeah.
and JPAs about how we were going to work together.
Yep.
There's a variety of ways at which that was done, and there's a lot of different models out there, but that's absolutely what happened. And then those GSAs had to come together to form a groundwater sustainability plan that they turned into the state and said, here's how we're going to be sustainable out for the next 20 years.
And so every GSA produced their own plan, or they all had to come together. So in one basin, you could
Right.
have, you were mentioning before this, I mean, I can't remember how many, you said
Yeah.
17 or 27
27, yeah.
different entities within a subbasin
Yeah.
that have to come together to be able to produce a plan saying we're going to keep our groundwater level stagnant at some level.
Right.
And so I can only, I mean,
Yeah.
how does that play out?
That's right. So, for instance, the Delta Mendota Subbasin has, I believe, 27 groundwater sustainability agencies that have to produce one GSP. But within that subbasin, those 27 GSAs actually produced 5 GSPs. So there's 5 GSPs within that
Right.
basin, but they then had to do a coordinated effort to take those 5 and have a coordinated plan that they took to the state. And there's a variety of entities. You have cities that rely on groundwater that can be within a GSP. You have water districts. You have state and federal, or actually state refuges, private refuges, a lot of diversity, folks that aren't in a water district. So you're right. They all had to figure out how to get in the same room, get organized. The first thing to do is get organized.
Yeah.
The second thing is how are we going to fund ourselves? And the third thing is we got to get moving forward on putting together our groundwater sustainability plan.
So some of these groundwater basins, or these sub-basins, we should call them, that have a lot of surface water coming in, they may be in a better position, right, than maybe some of these GSAs or these sub-basins that don't have a lot of surface water coming in.
That's right.
And we've been hearing a lot of terms being thrown around about whitelands. So can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so whitelands, as it's referenced within Sigma, is any land that's not within an existing, at the time, an existing water district, irrigation district, city boundary, etc., that didn't have access, for the most part, to surface water.
Okay.
So it's white land, and what the default was is if you weren't organized into a district and you weren't going to organize yourselves in a new district, there's been plenty of people since Sigma came out that decided, you know what, we better go out and form our own private mutual water company or form our own new water district, irrigation
Yep.
district. If they didn't want to do that, then by default, all those folks that weren't in an organized entity then came under the guise of the county. So the law said that any lands that weren't within these prescribed entities, the fallback was the county had to take them on. And I think if you gave the county truth serum, that wasn't a position the county wanted to be in. A lot of counties aren't set up for that. A lot of counties are very active in the water resource issues within their jurisdiction. Some aren't. But by default, they had to dive headlong into Sigma because of the wide area lands that they now had to manage and put a program together within that GSA for the GSP.
So the Whitelands areas really, they need to come up with an ability to become sustainable.
That's right.
But their issue that they're going to be faced with is, how do you do that if you don't have the infrastructure to be able to bring in surface water to be able to then irrigate? Because the Whitelands, again, are 100% groundwater irrigated.
Most part,
right?
yeah, for the most part. There are some wide area lands out there that were had some access to adjacent water districts, irrigation districts in water-rich years where they had conveyance agreements or annual water contracts to get supplemental water supply from them. But you're right, for the most part, they didn't have access to a lot of surface water, so relied heavily on groundwater and didn't have any conveyance facilities, pipelines, ditches, canals to bring outside water in because they were solely focused on farming and production from the asset of groundwater.
So the critically overdrafted subbasins, there was maybe 5 of them, I believe.
I think there was a few more than that,
Okay.
but yeah, it was a handful of them, mostly within the San Joaquin Valley and going south to Kern County.
Right.
That's correct.
So they are now 3 years into their first 5-year phase.
That's right.
So what has happened with the groundwater sustainability plans that a lot of these GSAs or subbasins have submitted to the state?
Yeah, so the initial submission a couple of years ago, the vast majority of them got feedback, written formal feedback from the Department of Water Resources that their plans were rejected. And they were rejected for a variety of reasons, which the state documented in a letter back to them. So what they did is the state told them you have 6 months, 180 days to go back and revise and fix your plan, send it back to the Department of Water Resources. Their process is they will then take that plan, submit it to open for public comment so the citizens of California could take a look at it, they could get comments, and then the state was going to go back and look at these plans and come back. So in our case, in this area, a couple subbasins and their GSPs were rejected. We turned revised documents back to them in July of 2022.
Okay.
And we still have not got a formal letter back in terms of did our plans meet the goals and objectives in their eyes of being sustainable to 2040 or did they not. The latest we heard is maybe mid to late March. We'll get those plans back and further comments from DWR.
So then what happens if the revised plans that you've submitted don't pass the muster again?
Good question. We're not really sure. DWR has been a little bit coy about that. I think DWR would love all these plans to pass muster so they can pass them on to us. We can continue down the path of implementing projects and programs that get us to where we need to be. What we have heard is there's a potential, if they're rejected, they're going to send them back to us and tell us one more time, here's what you got to fix.
Right.
I don't know why they wouldn't do that. But what we have heard is when we get that letter and the document back, I think there will be an official letter going to the State Water Resources Control Board, notifying the board of the subbasins that still have not met compliance after these were sent back to them for the first time. So I think that may happen. But I can't believe this DWR will throw in the towel and just turn all this over to the State Water Board. I don't think
that basically means the government would come in and manage some of those subbasins or GSAs.
Yeah, and I don't think the State Water Board's geared up to do that.
Right.
They've got enough on their plate right now. I don't think they'd want to do that, but I think that's where the rubber will hit the road eventually.
Yeah.
Especially in my mind, if the local GSAs aren't making a true effort to get stuff done. I don't think that's the case.
Right.
I don't know the ins and outs of all the resubmitted critically overdrafted subbasins when they turned it back in. But I think everybody made a true effort to get them fixed and updated.
Yeah.
We'll have to see. There's only been a couple that have come out, and they're smaller districts,
Yeah.
mostly on the coast. But nobody in the valley has got their plans back yet.
So we keep talking about these sustainability plans.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that are in those sustainability plans that would try to rectify basically the demand on groundwater?
Yeah. So when it was drafted, they were pretty specific on things that you had to, the hurdles you had to cover.
Yeah.
And you'll hear a lot about stuff, measurable objectives, minimal thresholds, a lot of technical jargon that gets thrown around and is in these plans. But really, they were focused on 5 or 6 things. The state was when they implemented the legislation. One is are you sustainable in terms of your groundwater levels? What do your groundwater level look like now? What they look like 15 years ago, and what are they going to look like by 2040? What's your groundwater storage component in terms of available space to storing groundwater? What does that look like in the past, now, and in the future? You also had to focus on subsidence. Is subsidence an issue in your area? How are you going to fix that? Also, how you're going to handle seawater intrusion. That was pointed out. That doesn't obviously affect us here in the valley, but it is a critical component. Delta area and over on the coast, whether it's Monterey, et cetera. And then what are you going to do with the issue of domestic wells, both for a domestic homeowner that owns a house on 10 acres and has a well that's 40 feet deep, and that they've been pumping that well for 40 years, and now some of those wells are going dry. Some of those wells are going off in terms of quality. And then a lot with all these small communities, communities that really grew over time because of the agricultural sector as California developed. But a lot of those small communities were either losing their wells, the water was running dry, or they're having issues with water quality. So that issue drove SGMA quite a bit when it was being developed. But those 5 or 6 issues are ones that are really drive that you have to show you're going to be sustainable. Of those 6, you may only have 2 or 3 in your subbasin that you got to work on. And then you really got to focus on your overdraft. Are you pumping more water than annually it's reproducing itself in terms of...
So how are people doing that? I mean, what are these GSAs or these subbasins doing? I mean, are they going to farm less acres, or I mean, what's really going to happen?
Yeah, every subbasin is different, and I can only speak on some that I know and some that I'm involved in. And a couple in this area, it's really being driven by subsidence, and subsidence is over pumping the lower aquifer, which is the aquifer below the Corcoran clay layer here. That's very prevalent in the Central Valley, and as you head south. And so as you pump too much water from below that Corcoran clay layer, it creates a pressure differential, pulling that water through the clay, and it collapses the clay, and you can't get that subsidence back once you lose that. So if you're in an area where you got to get subsidence under control, there's only one way you can do it. You don't have to completely shut down pumping, but you really got to back off your deep aquifer pumping. So that gives you a few options. You can either try to pump more from the shallow aquifer. Now, there's a reason guys are already in the deep aquifer, mainly because a lot of it, there is no shallow water, or if there is water above the Corcoran clay, it may not be as good of quality. So you got to come up with a program. And to do that, you've got to be able to get more groundwater or more water in that shallow aquifer. So you hear a lot about recharge. So taking as much water as you can in wet and plentiful years and getting it in the ground and recharging that aquifer so you can then pump. And then the second thing you could do is try to get access to surface water. For every acre foot of surface water you're able to bring in a farm with, that's 1 acre foot that you can back off in terms of your deep pumping. So that's sort of things that looking at in subsidence areas is access to surface water and then recharge to the lower or the upper aquifer and pump from there. So that we see some really good things happening in that area, in certain areas of the county and certain areas of the local GSAs. This overdrafting happens a lot in various areas. That, along with falling groundwater tables, it may come down to you just might not be able to farm as many acres because you got to back off on the pumping. If you can't put enough water in the ground during wet years to satisfy the aquifer and get it to stabilize, and if you can't get our surface water component managed better in terms of putting every drop of surface water to beneficial use where it needs to be, if you don't get those two things under control or get more aggressive about how you're going to manage that, you're never going to be able to
You're
catch
never gonna-
up.
yeah, and you'll never pass.
You'll never pass the sniff test.
Yeah.
Both the sniff test at the state level and farmers in the local community, they know it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if we're honest with ourselves, there's probably some land put in production within the whole state of California that it was 100% groundwater at the time.
Yeah.
If we look back, maybe too much of it was planted in certain areas. And as landowners and farmers and businessmen, you take a lot of risk, and maybe some of that's catching up to us.
Yeah.
But I truly believe that some of that land can stay in production if we manage our surface water better. We all got to work together, and that's the interesting thing about SGMA. It's forcing the locals within that basin to work
Yeah.
together, and still, we're not sometimes really good at getting that done.
Yeah, and I feel like that's been one of the critical components is
That's right.
kind of the conflicting ideas, the conflicting opinions on
Yeah.
how and what way people should become more compliant.
That's right.
Right, and
That's right.
you know, in our local area, you know, they've been trying to pass, I think, additional taxes on whiteland areas
Mm-hmm.
to be able to bring in the infrastructure and bring water into those districts.
That's right.
That's gotten kind of a little bit of pushback.
Right.
You know, at the end of the day, it just seems like less farmable ground is going to be available over time to be able to rectify or be in compliance with a lot of these GSPs. Right?
Yeah, I think you hear a lot of things out there that come from the state and all over, 700,000 to 1 million acres of land
Yeah.
out of production over time. A lot of it because of SGMA-related activities
Right.
and not enough groundwater. We'll have to wait and see if those numbers come to fruition. But I truly believe that the acres are going to have to come out of production.
Yeah.
It's can we get them out of production in a market-driven economy, not through pure regulation, where if you have to get out, at least some of these landowners can get some assets back out before it's too late. For some guys, it may already be too late.
Meaning real estate values will be
Property
declining.
values. That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
And we're doing SGMA at a time when we're seeing just commodity prices for a big chunk of commodities in our area, tree crops, et cetera, that are just really in the tank. And so you're trying to ask growers to take some land out of production. You're trying to ask growers to front some money through a Prop 218 tax,
Yes.
whether it's $5 an acre or $25 an acre or $250 an acre. And when they just don't have a lot of revenue on the backside in terms
Right.
of commodity prices.
Right.
So yeah, it's tough.
You know, we were looking at it, and we believe there's almost 300,000 acres of almonds that are in whitelands. You know, and for us, I mean, that's our business.
That's right.
Right, and so we're always trying to think about, okay, what does that mean? Because it's not just the whiteland production that's going to be hampered or lessened. It's also some of these districts that don't really have a lot of surface water deliveries.
That's right.
They may be classified as an irrigation district or a water district, but maybe they solely rely on groundwater, 9 out of 10 years.
That's right.
And so really those acres are also very exposed to SGMA. We think there's probably another 300,000 close to acres in those kind of lower tier districts.
Yep.
So it is for us a head scratcher with, okay, as the DWR comes back with their comments on the GSPs,
Right.
what happens next? And it's on our doorstep. You're
That's
saying
right.
it could be as early as March that you start to hear back a little bit.
That's right.
So
No, you're right. And a lot of these districts, some of our Central Valley Project districts on the west side, if you go out there now and look at their landscape, there's already been land taken out of production.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of that land will be in. And you're right, they're having to rely some more on groundwater because of their allocation over the last 10 years has been all over the board. In the last 5 years hasn't been good at all.
Right.
And the last 2 years has been zero.
Yeah.
So when you get a zero supply allocation and the water transfer market is tight, you really only have two options. You fallow some land,
Right.
and then you pump more groundwater if it's available, and where places where it's available, it's not very good. So you're seeing a lot of water being pumped and used on commodities and trees and stuff with boron and salt levels that even farmers know they shouldn't be using.
Yep.
But they're just trying to get by. But on the flip side, it's going to take them a long time to leach that soil and get it back to where it needs to be.
So where do you see kind of the future of SGMA going? I mean, I know we're going to hear back on a lot of these GSPs that have been put out, but I mean, is there going to be more of a free market for transferring water credits within the same sub-basin? I mean, are you seeing creative ideas like that come about, or is that kind of being
No,
stifled?
we are seeing it. In fact, there's a couple districts down in Tulare and Kern County
Yeah.
that have been very aggressive and very good at developing the crediting market
Yep.
and putting the backbone to some programs and projects for growers to track their pumping, to track how much they're recharging, to track what their credits look like. And as those programs develop, I believe that it's going to have to be a free market system for it to work.
You got to encourage people to put the infrastructure in.
That's right. That's right. Just like I really believe that you've got on the surface water side, you got to have a true free market system within the confines of the water district and irrigation districts, at least to have the ability to transfer water and convey water to surrounding areas,
Right.
whether it's to other irrigation and water districts within their place of use, or even being able to develop programs and projects and infrastructure to get water out to maybe some wide area lands that
Right.
are within the place of use, whether it's the state of California or the Bureau of Reclamation on the federal side.
Okay.
But I really think it's going to take farmers getting in the room. They're going to have to make some hard decisions. They're going to have a lot of different viewpoints, and it's all going to come down at the end of the day to water rights. The state of California has a very, I think, good water right backbone that was developed in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and I hope that never goes away. But it's all based on seniority,
Right.
and so you have these basins. A lot of them have some very senior water right holders that are within the same basin of very junior water right holders, and at the end of the day, they're going to protect their asset. But how do those senior and junior water right holders
Play.
maximize and play in the room together to maximize surface water deliveries so they can minimize the effects on the overlying groundwater pumping they got to do in combination with that?
And the economics for everybody,
And
right?
the
At the end of the day, your real estate values are probably going to fluctuate and vary quite dramatically, which they probably already are today.
They already have.
Based on water availability, right?
That's right. Yeah, I saw it sort of happen in Kern County first and move
Yeah.
its way up here. We're seeing it now over the last couple of years. When Sigma first got implemented and we were all trying to get our arms wrapped around how we're going to put these GSPs together, even if you were in a wide area, your land values were still pretty good. And we were working with growers that were in the wide area. Hey, what's your next 5 years going to look like? And now we're 3 or 4 more years into it, and it's
Yeah.
the land values. You can really see the differential, and a lot of it's based on really access to surface water.
Yep.
If you only have one source of water and it's groundwater in a big chunk of the state of California, it's going to be tough. It really is.
And banks have started really looking at your water supply.
That's right.
To be able to lend money too.
Yeah, absolutely. You probably heard it 100 times that they're all looking for 2 sources of water.
Yeah.
So if you're 100% groundwater, no access to the surface water, when you're going out to get money, it's going to be tough. They're looking for a second source.
Yeah.
It may not be second source may not be available every year, but if you have access to it, and my thought process is work within the confines of the existing system. Make sure the state legislature doesn't confine you, but we have to have the ability to move water north to south, east to west.
Yeah.
Our conveyance system originally was set up really good, running north to south, some east to west, but there's a lot of holes in it. And for people that can afford to build some more infrastructure, get hooked into the system, there's certain years where there's enough water available. You just got to be able to convey it and put it to beneficial use, whether that's direct delivery to your farm or put it into the ground for
Yeah.
storage
Get some
for
credit.
a future year, get some
Right,
credit. That's
right.
absolutely right.
Is there anything else we've left out on kind of the higher level of what Sigma is? And
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. Yeah, absolutely.
And if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way?
Yeah, my name is Chase with Water and Land Solutions.
Okay.
My phone number is 209-704-5101 and 5105, and you can look us up on the internet as well. But,
Okay, cool.
All right.
Well, thank you very much, Chase, for coming on. Really
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.